very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited today to have this opportunity to share with you folks what I've been learning over the last number of years. Think of this as the update or part 2 from that growth mindset workshop that we did a couple of years back. Now, as we're going through the morning, we're going to be going straight ahead through a fair bit of stuff, so if you do need a break, feel free to duck out when you need to, but otherwise it's full steam ahead for today. I would like to encourage you to put away the electronic devices and so on so you can focus your attention on our discussions and the ideas that we're talking about. So thank you very much. Now, the question that got you out of bed this morning might have been, how do people learn? But I think the real burning question is, what's it like being a physics teacher, right? That's what you've been wanting to know all this time. And it's not the life of glamour and fame that you might think. In fact, there's a lot of challenges that the physics teacher faces in their lives. And they often come up at, well, not the swanky cocktail parties, but the more mundane ones. Because there's always this awkward moment. Chatting with people, and inevitably the conversation comes up, so what do you do? And then I say, well, I'm a physics teacher. And the response is almost always the same. The eyes widen, you can see them take a little step back, and they're kind of looking at you like you're from a different planet. And then they say something kind of like this. They say, oh, physics, eh? Wow, really hated it in high school. Definitely my worst subject. Or the best that you can hope for is, oh yeah, I like physics, but I did very badly in it. All this negativity associated with it. So, over the years, you develop a pretty thick skin as a physics teacher. And this translates into our classrooms as well, because that thick skin has protected us from a lot of the shortcomings of our teaching. The terrible attrition rate in high school physics, the least popular of the 3 high school senior sciences. It has protected us from the appalling gender imbalance in our physics classes for so many decades. So despite these things, right, we've been telling ourselves all this time, oh, we're doing great, it's awesome. We just kind of shrug our shoulders about these difficulties that we face. But what really burst our bubble as a teaching profession was not any of these things. It was a multiple choice test. 30 questions on core physics ideas. And they even took the math part out of these questions because, the kids kind of get tripped up on the math sometimes. And this test is called the Force Concept Inventory. And the questions look something kind of like this. I'm not going to make you do any physics today. It's all right. But, you're swinging a ball around, and at a certain moment in time, the string breaks. And then in what direction does the ball travel? So you make your choice. What do you think? Swing it around and... Awesome. It is answer B. You do have a future in physics. That's excellent. Now, if you give these questions to a physics teacher, a crusty old physics teacher, they'll say, oh, these questions are so easy. They're like giveaways. But something very interesting happens when you give them to students. So these are very typical numbers. If at the start of your course, you give this battery of 30 questions to your students, they might score something like this, 45%. They come into your class with a bit of knowledge, but not too much. And so you might be thinking, all right, this is excellent because we have 55% as our room for improvement. And this is where your awesome teaching kicks in. And then at the end of the course, you give them the exact same set of 30 questions. And what do they score? Very typical number, an improvement of 12.7%, or this is the number that the physics people like to bandy about. We call it the gain. If you take how much they actually improved, 12.7, divided by how much they could have improved, 55, you get this result of 23%. So this is how much students are benefiting from your instruction. And this was an eye-opening moment for the physics teaching community. And one of the most fascinating parts about this result is it doesn't depend on the teacher. It doesn't depend on whether you've got this guy as your physics teacher or whether you've got this guy. It doesn't depend on how charismatic the person is at the front of the room. It seems to depend on something else. Now, we've always had a sense that this is probably true. Because maybe you've had this experience as well. You put together your best lesson ever. So you come up with this great idea, okay, I know what to do. And you organize it so very carefully, and then in the lesson itself, you show the students amazing things they never thought were possible. And by the end of it, you're convinced you've taught this so well that even monkeys can do this, right? Perhaps you've had this experience. And then comes the quiz, the test, or the exam, and they bomb it in epic proportions. And you're left wondering, what's going on upstairs? Why did I ever become a teacher? So, what's going on here? This poor teacher, you've probably heard the person talking in the staff room, or maybe you've said things like this yourself. I know I have. You're kind of looking up to the skies and saying, I'm doing my job teaching. Why aren't students doing their job learning? What's going on here? Well, what is the measure of good teaching? Is it how well the material is presented? I mean, look at this guy. Dressed for success, got the look of authority there. Or is it how well the students are learning? And how do we answer a question like this? Well, my suggestion, and this is the theme of our workshop this morning, that we should answer this question by using science. And this is why I'm so excited to share these ideas with you today, because I really believe that we are in the midst of a scientific revolution for learning. As research advances, we are able to put together a scientific picture of what's going on in our students' brains when they learn. And that forced concept inventory that I showed you from about 30 years ago was the first wave of this. And the benefits of this scientific revolution is that it provides a very valuable antidote for a lot of the things that hold back the educational system. It provides an antidote for pedagogical fads, which I'm sure we've all been subjected to. It provides a very valuable antidote for the prejudices that we all hold about what is good and effective teaching. And it could provide an antidote for the personal inertia that we often feel when we're thinking about making changes to the way that we teach. And importantly for today, it provides us with new and valuable tools that will allow us to ask helpful questions like this. What is happening in our students' brains when they learn? So what I'm sharing with you today is my own synthesis of a combination of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, discipline-based education research, and a lot of classroom practice. Put this all together, and this is what I think makes up a real science of learning. And I also need your help, because when I do my presentations, I often get questions like this. Sure, these ideas work for physics, but what about all these other things? Now, what I'm sharing with you today, I believe, and I think the research strongly supports, that they are general principles of human learning. But I will really benefit from your ideas and your expertise in how this appears in other courses. I also get asked, well, you've got, your grade 11 academics, but what about all these others? And again, I need your help with these parts. And that's one of the reasons why we have the chart paper at your tables today. So, our workshop this morning is put together in a series of scenes from your teaching life, presented with the dramatic flair that you would expect from a physics teacher. And start off with our first scene. Here we go. A student is working on something and they give up quickly, all exasperated. And you thinking to yourself, come on, you haven't even tried. So that was the scene. I hope you weren't expecting like Laurence Olivier or anything. That's what you get. So why does this happen? So I'd like you to take 1 minute, turn to your neighbors, and share your ideas. Go. So this morning we're going to have a lot of very short discussions. So it's really helpful if we can start and stop very quickly. We make really good use of our time today. So there's a lot of possible explanations for why this happens. And I want to share with you one which might be new for you. If we take a look inside the brain itself, we go down to the deepest level, you can see the neurons firing away together. And as the neurons grow and do their thing, they sprout connections, dendrites and axons, and these reach out to the other neurons in the brain. And this is the process of learning itself, at a very basic level. Now what you're seeing here are images of neurons growing in a petri dish, in a laboratory. What about the actual brains in our classroom? Well, we can see this happening as well. Thanks to advances in medical imaging, we can identify areas in the brain that increase in size as students, as people learn new tasks. So as they're learning a new task for the first few weeks, we've got up to 4 weeks here, there's an increase in the mass of the gray matter of that part of the brain. And then sure enough, if you're not using that new skill, if you're not using that part of the brain, the area shrinks. The brain is a hugely energy-intensive part of our body, and so it's extremely economical with its energy resources. Now, the important idea for us here is that our brain is behaving just like muscles do, and this is an analogy, a picture that students can understand. Our body adapts itself in order to perform the tasks that are necessary for it. And just as our muscles do, our brain does as well. Now we can also take another perspective on the learning process. If we look at these magnetic resonance imaging scans of brains at 3 stages in learning, we see this. Now, the white areas that you see highlighted here are regions in the brain where there is higher than normal flows of blood. And so this is indicative of those neurons requiring more energy to do their job. So we think these are the parts of the brain that's doing the hard work. Now, if we take a look at and compare the novice brain with the skilled or the expert brain, we can see a real difference in those pictures. And so this is our next discussion. Just turn to your neighbor and 2 questions. What is happening? What do you think is happening in the brain, the novice versus the expert? And how do you think this feels to the owner of the brain? So just turn to the person sitting beside you. We'll have a quick 1-minute chat. Go. Jenna.
The novice brain is making a lot of mistakes, and so there's a lot of firing going on, and the skilled brain has made those mistakes, so they're trimming.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Dan?
To understand anything, you have to build a framework or structure in your brain that can cope, that can put it together. That requires growth itself. Once you actually become an expert, the structure is already there. Therefore, all it requires is maintenance. So there's a tremendous amount more energy involved in the first stage. Plus, it highlights the fact that learning a little every day and building your construct is way more effective than shoving all that stuff in your brain and expecting it to deal with it the next day.
Great. Thank you very much. Very good there. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, if you take a look at this brain, it's lighting up like the 1st of July. And those neurons don't know, which way to fire in order to have the person accomplish this task. And so, how does it feel to be the owner of this brain? It feels
Exhausting. Yeah,
It feels exhausting. It's very tiring. That's right. And how does it feel to be the owner of this brain? Pretty awesome, right? So that's a huge difference. And this is a really important lesson for us to understand, and also for students, that learning something is really energy intensive for our brains. And it's tiring, and that's a natural and normal part of the learning process. It's not because you're dumb. It's not because you can't get it. It happens to all of us. So if you take a look at the expert brain, one of its characteristics is that the skills, so this is you and I, the skills that we demonstrate in our classrooms are very fluent. They are almost invisible to us. They're very likely invisible to our students, and they happen automatically, effortlessly. But if you take a look at the novice brain, the opposite is the case. The skills are not fluent, they are very effortful and slow. And the kids feel this difference. So if you think about, the journey that this brain has been on for years and years, our brains are hardwired to learn. Especially when we're young, we take the setbacks, we take that tiring sensation, that feeling, and we just run with it until the skill is entirely fluent and we don't think about it anymore. And when we're little, we do this automatically. But when we get older, we start to criticize ourselves when we have that feeling of the tired, effortful brain. So in our science of learning, I think this is a really important piece, the physical workings of the brain. And so let's now we're going to take about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about our classroom practice. So here's the core idea. Learning is tiring, but with persistence, the skill or the understanding becomes easy. And you've done this many times already in so many different skills. So in our classroom, how do we help students understand this idea? So you have some chart paper on your table. I would like one person to volunteer to be the official recorder and try to think of ideas or ways in which you could help your students learn this in the context of your class. So we'll take about 5 or 10 minutes. We'll just see how the discussions go. Okay. So please nominate a recorder and start your discussions. So thank you very much for the suggestions and the ideas that you are coming up with there. And now it's time for our second scene. So in our second scene, we have you in front of your classroom, and you're saying, okay, everybody, I want you to, and it could be a variety of different things. Take out your notebook, turn to your neighbor, and discuss an idea. But a student simply refuses. So why does this happen? Okay, this is a quick 1-minute discussion. Go.
One is because they have no connection to the word.
And there's a lot of different possible reasons. What do you have? Genesis?
Auditory processing deficit. The words are not making meaning in the
Thank you.
Anybody else? James?
They don't want to show that they might not have understood or have other people judge that they didn't get it.
They don't want to show that they might be missing some understanding. Anybody else?
They
Yeah,
don't
mister?
feel like it and they don't see the point.
Just
It's not
don't
gonna be
feel like it.
evaluated. They've had a fight with their girlfriend. They don't want to.
Yeah. Yes. Their attention is elsewhere. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. So, I think another important piece of the science of learning is the emotional aspect of learning, and your ideas are touching upon that. Now, as a physics teacher, if you would have talked to me 10 years ago, I would have made some sort of snide remark about emotion and learning and saying, oh, you guys go sit in a circle and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But the reality is different. We might wish that we could all teach the Vulcans of the world, these ultra-rational beings, but the science is not there. The science is telling us that cognition cannot be separated from emotion. Right? So appearing in our classroom is not the Vulcans, right? It's these. We get the humans in our classroom, along with the brains that they bring, which have been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. And these brains are survivors. This is the essence of the human brain. It's there to help the organism survive. And old trick. And so these survival mechanisms are deeply wired in the mammalian brain, and they bring along with them very powerful emotional responses. So I'd like to take a minute to highlight these key strategies that our brain uses, and then we can think about how they are reflected in our classroom. The brain wants to understand its environment. Have you played this game? Drop it on the floor, pick it up, drop it on the floor, and pick it up. Or the brain wants to control its body. Oh, hands. Awesome. One hand, two hands. Look at them go. Oh, touch them together. What an amazing discovery. Hands. The brain really wants to control its own body and avoid danger. So cool. And then they put it on the internet.
Yeah.
Parenting these days. Right, very powerful response. Avoid danger. And babies, they're just awesome. But perhaps even better than babies, right, monkeys. The brain wants to find pleasurable things.
Some do anything for an alcoholic cocktail.
Look at that guilty monkey. It'll do anything for a bit of booze. So these are core survival mechanisms for our brain. And they bring along with them a very powerful emotional response, which takes place in our classrooms. It's taking place here right now. It's fundamental to how we work as human beings. And it's really helpful for us to think, in our classroom, how do these survival mechanisms manifest themselves? So what are some positive examples of avoiding danger, finding pleasurable things, controlling your body? And what are negative examples of these that we find daily in our classrooms? So quick 1-minute discussion. Go. The examples of this are much more numerous than we often realize. Let's start off with the avoiding danger. Would anybody like to share an example of that behavior in our classrooms? You're exhibiting it right now. Eric?
I'm going to take a risk here and say, for some students, they will, let's say there's a whole curriculum worth of material. There's one section they feel very comfortable with, so they just keep doing practice problems from there, or they keep doing that one task that they know they can do well. And there's that thing later on that really scares them, so they just go back to, let's go back to this type of thing that I'm comfortable with. So I'm really good at writing a personal essay, but an analytical essay kind of scares them. I'm just going to write my
Great, so they're sticking to what they feel comfortable with.
Volunteering an opinion in case it might be something wrong.
Yeah, volunteering an idea in front of the class, a social danger. How about finding pleasurable things?
Right there.
Right, what's the most common distraction in our classroom?
Cell phones.
Right, so those are instant hits for the students. Any other ideas? Finding pleasurable things? There's other ways in which this happens. One structure that we try to set up in our classrooms in order to encourage this is marks. We want the students to chase after the marks. And then controlling one's body. What are examples of that?
Do it in my class all the time.
Just being able to walk around, often related to those bathroom trips. Or just deciding when you want to talk, when you want to do it, as opposed to having strict moments in time, when you're supposed to or you're not. There's so many different ways in which these ideas are manifested in our classroom. It's really valuable for us to think about it because of the powerful emotional responses that go along with. Now I want to focus on one very important one, and this is how the brain protects itself. So there's a part of our brain in the back that's responsible for collecting inputs from our senses. And then these inputs are channeled to a part deep inside the brain called the amygdala. It came up in yesterday's presentations. And the job of the amygdala is to protect the organism, to protect the brain. And then when it takes in those signals, it can decide and send commands to your prefrontal cortex. That's where you do your decision making. And so this part, the amygdala, is responsible for our fear response to most situations. And the best way of describing it is the amygdala is a really serious job, and it doesn't want to let the body down. So it forces us to focus on the negative things, because if there's a saber-toothed tiger bearing down upon you, it doesn't want the rest of your brain thinking about that tasty meal that you had last night, positive things. It just hijacks the brain and takes control. Now this happens not just when there's physical danger, but when there's a whole variety of social dangers. Dangers due to the interactions between people, or internal dangers to a student's self-esteem. This part kicks in because it takes its job really seriously. And if the person becomes habituated to this response to situations, then it produces a physical response in the body. And that's what we call anxiety. So this is a learned response as a result of that amygdala firing regularly with commonly associated situations of danger. Now, in the educational system, these are often things like tests, or in particular associated with cultural, society-wide mathematics. People are afraid of math. This is the amygdala at work. And it's overdoing its job of protecting the organism. Now, the topic of anxiety is interesting for me because I spent years thinking, anxiety is something that students just kind of, they work themselves up into a frenzy. It's kind of imagined. But in a recent study done by high math anxiety adults, if you tell them there is a math question coming, and you're about to look at a math question, regions in the brain start firing away associated with the perception of physical pain. It sounds really strange. You're about to do math, but we all know what this feeling is like, right? You haven't got the needle yet, but you can feel it in your arm. This is the response of some people with to the anticipation of doing math. And you know, we're not talking fancy math. These were the questions the researchers were giving them. So it's really important for us as educators to think and be mindful of the negative emotional reactions that students can experience in our classrooms, because they affect how they learn. So what is the remedy for this? Well, I think it's success. Now, success is a much maligned idea, thanks in large part to the trophy people, or you know, the ribbon people. You probably know what I'm talking about here, right? Everybody gets a ribbon, everybody gets a trophy. Success, right? Help with self-esteem. But I'd like to show you a different idea of success. So this is a short series of excerpts from our physics classes here at York Mills.
Look at that. Ooh, look at that. Yeah, that means precise calculation.
Good job, good job. Go ahead.
Higher. Oh my god, it's literally like right underneath.
Okay, good.
Whoa. Okay, go. Oh, that hurts.
It's so sick.
Yay, 1.0, almost to the dot.
Let me see.
So I think this is a very different kind of success from definitely from the ribbon and the trophy people. And I'd like you to take a moment and think why. So talk to your neighbors. Why is this kind of success fundamentally different? Go. Quick discussion. One way in which this type of success, so from a scientific point of view, is different from the others, especially the ribbon example, is, well, if you take a look at the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that does the abstract thinking, that part of the brain has the greatest number of receptors for the brain's natural happy drug, which is...
Okay. Oh, sorry. I mean,
which is dopamine. Sorry, X. And one of the reasons why this form of success is powerful is because it's based on the brain's internal reward system. So students are intrinsically feeling successful because, so in the context of physics, they're completing authentic tasks. They're using their skills to make something actually happen, and they test their idea and it works. So this is our powerful antidote to the other more negative emotional reactions that can happen in a classroom. And I think it's one that as teachers we need to exploit as often as possible. And so here we're going to have our second discussion on the chart paper. So humans like to do the things they are successful doing. So how do we help our students perceive in an authentic way that they are successful in our classrooms? How can we do that as regularly as possible? So see if you can share some ideas, brainstorm some ideas, jot them down on the chart paper. But what do you think? So go. So we had some good discussions about creating a regular sense of success in our classrooms. And now we're ready for our third scene. So you've probably had this experience where you're working with a kid and they've got it. But maybe the very next day they come back and it's like they're back to zero. What's going on there? To help us understand, let's think about a skill testing question here. Compare the size of the numbers, 4 and 8. Well, I won't ask you to answer that. So very early on, kids studying math figured this out. So 4 is less than 8. But what about a question like this? If you take a look at these numbers, if you're working with a young person, what are they likely to respond in this situation? Which is larger?
The 8.
Right? 1 over 8. So why does this happen? If the empty vessel model of the brain is a correct one, then the teacher has likely done their job of teaching the fraction ideas, so that's been poured in, and then we've screwed on the lid, hopefully tightly, and they do it in the classroom, but they come back the next day as if they weren't there. So this model of learning is simply false. So let's explore the structure of knowledge in the human brain. So to the best of our understanding, so from the point of view of these ideas originated in cognitive linguistics, and they're backed by a lot of neuroscience research. So we believe that knowledge is not stored as complete things in the brain. It's stored as little pieces, smaller ideas that make up a whole, like numbers indicate the size of things. The ideas of less than, greater than, the idea of fractions as parts of a whole. And then as people learn, as students learn, they form connections between these ideas. And the connections grow over the course of their lifetime and form this vast and complex web of what we call knowledge resources. So this is how we believe knowledge is stored in the brain. And when it comes time, when the student enters our classroom, this collection of knowledge resources and that network is what we call the student's prior knowledge. This is what they bring into our classrooms in preparation for our learning environment. And when we as humans recall information, make use of skills, we are activating parts of these networks. Now, in the case of the fraction example, we want a very particular network to fire. So we're starting off here with that basic idea that numbers indicate the size of something. We want to go through a particular pathway and say, okay, yeah, if you take 1 and you divide it by a big number, you actually get a smaller number. So this is the network we want the students to activate. But which one often gets activated, especially early on? It's more like this. Number equals size, and larger number means more. Now, both of these networks are in the brain at the same time. But because of the student's sum total life experiences, one of these networks is much stronger than the other. And unless they've developed that next stage of cognition to be able to carefully analyze a question and decide what knowledge is useful at that moment in time, then the stronger network is the one that's most likely to be activated. So if you just give them that question the next day, it kind of makes sense that they come up with the incorrect answer, because throughout the rest of their lives prior to that lesson, this is what they have learned and been reinforcing in their minds. So this is a really important lesson for us as teachers. So very strongly connected prior knowledge can conflict with the new knowledge that we're trying to instill in our students. And this can happen for a surprisingly long time. It can happen for weeks, months, years, because those other networks are so strong. So if we look into the mind of the expert, here's another very important characteristic of that mind. Their connections in those mental networks are very strong and stable. They fire reliably. But for the novice, the connections are weak and unstable. They might fire some of the time, but not in others. And so this is the third piece of our scientific picture of learning. So you folks have been doing really well today. It's time for a test. So here is a set of symbols and a set of numbers. I'd like you to study this. Okay, this is going to be very important because I'm going to test you on it. I want to explain why it's important. Actually, I will. This is going to be on your next TPA. Is that right, Jennifer? We're good to go with this? So take a look at the shapes and the numbers. All right, and now, test time. The very top one. What number does that set of symbols represent? Just shout it out.
30.
Everybody. Just shout it out.
38.
Okay, good, good. Oh, what about the next one? 27. Last one?
40.
Zero, yeah.
Okay, so that was okay. That was okay. Now what I want you to do is take a minute with your neighbors and discuss the patterns that you see. Go. Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps you're familiar with a piece of technology like this. Right? It's called a phone. Back in the olden days, you had the buttons on them. Yeah. And you see the connection there? Right.
Oh, come on. Way too small. Our way is better.
So, time for another test. What's the first number indicated here? Just shout it out.
6.
Oh, no. It is 20.
2, 3. 2 times 3.
23.
First one is 23.
Yes.
And the next one? 48. And
1, 0, yeah, 10.
5. 1 and 5.
1, 15.
5.
That's right.
there we go. Good job. So, let's put that into perspective. In the span of about
That was mine.
Oh, yeah.
in the span of about 2 minutes' time, you went from being at-risk students and to being confident, top of the class. That's awesome. Awesome. Right, it's obviously your teacher, right? So, this is another really important example of the significance of prior knowledge. Prior knowledge can hinder learning in certain cases, but helpful prior knowledge can greatly assist learning, especially if it's analogical. We are very analogical learners in almost all respects. So if we can help students draw connections to their prior knowledge, this will assist their learning. And if we help them understand some of the challenges with the prior knowledge that might interfere, then we can help get them over some very important hurdles in their learning. And it's time for us to jot down some ideas on the chart paper. So you might have to flip the page there. And here's our idea. Prior knowledge can help or hinder learning. So what are some examples of this from your classes? Okay, let's take 5 minutes to think of some ideas. Okay, go. So this is the final piece in the picture that we're putting together about how people learn. So if we give students some basic or standard task, they do very well on it. But if you give them something even just a little bit different, they tend to fall apart. And we've seen this happen so many times. Why does something like this happen? So let's think about it. Often as a teacher, we say in exasperation, oh, come on, right? You know it or you don't. Right? You should be able to use it here and use it there. And then often you make some sort of snide remark, oh, come on, it's not rocket science. But this perception that we have about using knowledge is not correct. It's not supported by the science. So knowledge resources, so getting back to that picture of the network, these knowledge resources are activated differently depending on the context in which the student is thinking. So going back to the fractions example, for an expert, you know that in this situation, this is the network that we want to use to get the right answer. In a slightly different situation, different fraction idea, you might be thinking about slices of pizza as a mental model of what's happening. Now, the expert is able to very quickly and easily choose between these. But for the novice, so that's the expert's brain. Right? The knowledge resources are very richly connected based on context. But in the novice's brain, they have relatively fewer connections to these valuable pieces of knowledge, or the connections are weak enough that by the time the signal reaches the fraction zone of the brain, it's kind of petered out. And so they don't make the connections. So in their brain, the knowledge resources are sparsely connected. And so they tend to treat knowledge as a very blunt instrument. They take that same idea and they use it again and again, no matter what the situation is. Now, this is related to the psychological idea of transfer. So the ability to take knowledge learned in one context and to use it productively in a new context. And for many educators, this is considered the gold standard of learning. Right? You really know it if we can put you in a totally new situation and you can productively use these ideas. This is what we want our students to do in our classroom when we're challenging them to think critically. So the ability to transfer depends on having that richly connected set of knowledge resources. That idea of fractions as parts is connected to so many other ideas in their brain. And the question is, how do we help students make these connections? To understand that, we need to take a look at what I call the learning engine of the brain. The brain has 4 basic operations when it's learning something. So the names of the parts of the brain aren't so important. What is important is what they do. So at the back of the brain is the section that takes in the inputs from the senses. Now, then signals are sent to the sides of the brain, which is where those sensory ideas are connected, where we assign meaning to them. And then signals head to the prefrontal cortex, which is where we do our abstract thinking, our predicting, our planning. And then the signals go toward the top, the motor cortex, and this is when you do, or you test, or you make use of the ideas. This is a cycle. And it's a rough schematic of what happens in our brains. It's actually much more complicated, and there's more back and forth. But the basic idea is this cycle. And we call this the cognitive learning cycle. So it's a reflection of how the brain is hardwired to learn from those millions of years of evolution. In this graphic, we can trace the pathways that the signals in our brain travel, and we can see a loop going from back to front. That is similar to this cognitive learning cycle. We've got a loop going on there. So on a very deep level, this is how our brains work, how our brains are hardwired to make sense of their world. Right? This is that 4th survival mechanism. And the 4th piece in our scientific model of learning. So now that we have a science of learning to help us out, what happens when it's time to teach? So how can we use this in our teaching? So you have that enthusiastic teacher say, okay, I've learned all this stuff. Now I know where my students are having trouble and why. So I'm going to come up with an even better lesson. And so in your new lesson, maybe it's fractions, right? So maybe in your new lesson on fractions, you have better explanations than before, really carefully chosen examples that you show, and then you give them all these hard-earned strategies and tips that you figured out over the years. And then the test or the quiz comes along and they still bomb it. So if you think about this improved lesson, it hasn't taken advantage of the cognitive learning cycle. What it has done is it's provided students with an awful lot of input. It might be higher quality input, but it's still just that, just input. And the lesson has not given students the opportunity to reflect on that input, to make meaning or make sense out of it. Or a very typical lesson often involves moving around a lot of information. You're taking information from one source, maybe it's a textbook, and you're putting it somewhere else, maybe on a sheet of paper. Or you're doing a lot of math work. You're moving symbols around. This often takes place in the prefrontal cortex, that decision-making, the abstract thinking part of the brain, but it can happen with very little connection to the other parts. I just want to take an aside here. This is a great example of it, of the idea of grammar, so form and symbols versus meaning. Right? Classic poem from Lewis Carroll. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome rats outgave." So we can read that through, and you can probably answer simple questions about it, right? What were the slithy toves doing? All right, they're there gyring and gimbling away. Where are they doing this gyring and gimbling?
In the waves.
Where everybody does it, right? In the wave. And what were the borogroves like today? You know, they were very...
Mimsy.
Oh yeah, they're very mimsy today. And you got to watch out for those mome rats, right? Because they're outgraving everybody else. So our brain has developed all of these mental shortcuts. And this is the connection with what you saw at our previous meeting with the fast thinking versus the slow thinking. Right? Our brain has developed all these shortcuts to work with these ideas without having to make sense of them. And so we can do a lot of very complex work without understanding what it means. And that's really where the next part in this learning cycle kicks in. The student needs to do some meaningful testing of the ideas that they are learning. And then that test becomes the next input to continue the cycle. This is how our brains are hardwired to learn. So this learning cycle is our brain's strategy for making sense. So we make sense of new ideas by forming connections to our prior knowledge. But without opportunities to make sense, then our students can't transfer knowledge successfully. They could memorize it, they could spit it back, but they won't be able to productively use it in new situations. So we need to provide them with opportunities to make these rich connections between what we want them to learn and all these other ideas. And only the students can do this. As teachers, we're stuck on the outside. We're stuck providing inputs for them. It's the student who has to assign the meaning to it. You can tell them why these ideas are so important, but they have to figure that out. And then they have to use those ideas to plan, to predict, to figure stuff out. And then the student has to make meaningful use of that knowledge. And then that becomes input for the next round. This is how the brain works. This is how it desperately wants to learn. And you can probably see our students' brains fighting to do this while we're trying to conduct our lesson. So if we think about our classroom practice, what this means is teachers can't tell students what to know. They really have to explore and construct and test and refine their understanding. They have to do that work, because we can't reach into their brains and make those connections for them. And for teachers, this is really frustrating, because we're very passionate about our subject areas. We have so much to share, so much wisdom to give out. But we have to learn to adjust that to meet the students' needs, as opposed to meeting our needs to share. So if we try to look for pedagogy that most closely matches the way that the brain works, using science as our guide, the best fit will produce the most learning. The closest match that we have is inquiry. And the ideas that I've presented today help us to understand why inquiry is such an effective way for humans to learn, because it so closely matches the cognitive learning cycle, the way that our brains have evolved to make sense of the world. Here's a quick example from our grade 10 science course. So if we look at the life cycle of a cell, how the cell does its job living and then reproducing, we give our students a very simple input. So instead of a lengthy lesson about all the different parts and so on, they get just a simple picture like this. And the follow-up questions to this have the students assign meaning to what they see. So how many phases are in the cycle? Well, you can count the number of arrows. What is the order? So it's getting the students to sort out the information that they're presented with. And then we start asking more sophisticated questions. When does the size of the cells change? When do the numbers change? Oh, okay, from there to there, the size has changed. Oh, over here, the number is changing. So before we're bombarding them with too much information, they're having a lot of opportunity to make sense of what they're seeing. And then they're making use of the knowledge. So if we put a bunch of cells under a microscope, how many would you find in each of these stages? Oh, okay, well, this one here is really short, M stage. So probably few of those. And give them a slide or a cell culture and take a look. If there's just a few cells that have all wiggly spaghetti stuff as they're reproducing there. Oh, okay. Right, they have productively used their new knowledge in an authentic way. Right, we're not just checking off the answer on their piece of paper. They are going and finding an answer in a way that's meaningful for the discipline that they are learning in. So they've tested their knowledge. Oh, okay, it works. Yes. Dopamine hit. And then there's more input. We start to assign the technical jargon that goes along with it. But now, in their minds, their prior knowledge has been prepared. And they have a place to hook these new terms to, a meaningful place. And so this is helping them to learn. So this is an example of the cognitive learning cycle in action. Now, we've brought along some sample lessons for you today, and this is the final activity that we're doing together as a group. So what you'll find in the packages that we hand out here, maybe I could ask you to spread that around there. And that direction. So what you'll find in the package are two lessons. One is a history lesson that Risa has provided, and one is a physics lesson that I've provided. So we have chosen these because we think they're both a good example of the cognitive learning cycle and the pedagogical strategies that we've been talking about today. So you can turn to a neighbor and choose which one you would like to discuss. And then I want you to jot down which part of the cognitive learning cycle does each step in the lesson make use of? Or how do the steps or questions help the novice? So, this is our final activity for today. Choose your lesson and analyze it with your neighbors. Let's go. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for taking a look at those lessons. It's interesting to see the proportion groups which chose which lesson. Not taking it personally, of course. But we had the two there for the important contrast and for the opportunity to choose something that's probably closer to your comfort zone or your sphere of expertise. So let's put the final dressing on this and go back to that question that we started off with earlier on, which is, what is the measure of good teaching? Is it how well the material is presented? The scientific consensus is, well, this is really the least important part of it. What's really important is how well the students are learning. The material does have to be presented well, but our focus must be on what's going on in their brains. So our teaching goal is to help our novices develop some of the skills that experts have. We know that the vast majority of students are not going into our personal field of expertise, but we still want them to develop this rich set of skills that they can through our respective disciplines. So what matters most in our classrooms is what is going on in each student's head. It's not the song and dance that the teacher performs at the front. And so in our science of learning, just to quickly summarize, what we should challenge ourselves to do is this. We want to teach our students how their brains work. They've probably never seen the user's guide. And as experts, we can start to help them understand that. We need to design our lessons with emotion in mind. What is the emotional process that the students will be going through as they are tackling this challenge you've given them? Help students to recognize and connect what they're learning to their prior knowledge. And as much as possible, activate the cognitive learning cycle. So they are assigning meaning to all these inputs that we give them. They're using it and testing it and seeing, oh yeah, this stuff makes sense because I can use it. Now in today's workshop, I've been providing you with an awful lot of input. And through our discussions that we've been having, you've had some opportunity to try to draw connections to your own teaching experiences. And then hopefully you've had some discussions about, okay, how can we make use of these ideas in our classroom? So you're starting to think about making use. You're predicting and planning. And so the final piece to complete this learning, or really to start this learning cycle for you folks, is to do. Test these ideas in your own classroom. So this is the challenge that I present to you. Now, after I give my presentations, I often have conversations with teachers where they say, well, you know, I think I'm doing this already. Right? These ideas seem reasonable and familiar. Well, here's a simple test that you can use to help. It's a crude test, but I think it's also an effective one. Compare how much you talk about the ideas versus how much your students talk about them. In order to develop to your level of expertise, or at least an important step upwards from where the students are, they need to do more talking than you. And so that's a good, simple indication of how well these ideas are being used in your own teaching practice. Because if they are not talking about them, then they are not making sense of them. Now, we want to help you folks learn. And in our school, we're going to be setting up a small teacher learning library. I've ordered in some books for you. And if I was a little better organized, they would be here already. So they will be arriving before long. And the books include these, This is a fantastic resource, How People Learn. I stole the title of the presentation from this. It's a great sort of A to Z look at the science of learning from multiple perspectives, multiple teaching disciplines. And I highly recommend it. It's also available free online. So if you Google that title, you can download it. But we'll also have a hard copy in the school free to borrow. This is another fantastic book, The Art of Changing the Brain. This is where the ideas of the cognitive learning cycle and survival mechanisms come from. Now there's other books as well that I've ordered which connect with these, provide a bit more background information, and I encourage you to check those out. And as a general question for down the road, I'd like you to think, how can we help you folks learn more? So think about what the admin can do, what Risa can do, what I can do to help you learn more about these ideas and make productive use of them in your classroom. Now, if there's anything that you